Hi, hello. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Florian Endres. Hi, hello. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Florian Endres. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Comparative Literature, and I'm the organizer of this year's Department Lecture Series. As per usual, I want to thank my department for helping to put this event together, especially Valerie Kanka, as always, as well as the Humanities Council and the German department for their generous co-sponsorship. For those of you who are here for the first time, just a few words about the series. Under the title Universality and its Glitches, we have invited a total of 7 scholars to speak about universality, a term with an ambiguous reputation. Whereas today's default position seems to be a critique of its imminent exclusions, if not the outright claim of its impossibility, universal aspirations also appear to be inseparably linked to projects of political emancipation, scientific validity, and artistic merit. All of our speakers, who work in a variety of fields ranging from philosophy, psychoanalysis, and media studies, hold on to the critical dimension of universality, albeit in a new and enriched mode. They do so both through their critical scholarship and by way of their interventions as public intellectuals. There is hardly a better example for such a critical spirit than our guest today, who I'm especially excited to introduce to you. Mladen Dolar is a professor and senior research fellow at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Ljubljana and a professor of the European Graduate School. His principal areas of research are psychoanalysis, modern French philosophy, German idealism, and art theory. He has lectured extensively at universities in the US and across Europe, and he is the author of over 100 academic papers. Apart from 14 books in Slovene, his English publications include most notably A Voice and Nothing More, which has been translated into 10 languages, and Opera's Second Death, that he co-authored with Slavoj Žižek. His eagerly awaited newest book, The Riskiest Moment, is forthcoming with Duke University Press, the introduction of which has just been published online on eFlux. There, Mladen Dolar recalls an extraordinary anecdote regarding an encounter that Sigmund Freud, of all people, made in a cave in Slovenia, of all places. And I'm not telling you who he encounters. Please go ahead and read the articles. Fantastic. Mladen Dolar, I must mention, is one of the founders and major proponents of the famously infamous Ljubljana Lacanian School, a group of thinkers that have been serving as our own Slovenian cave guides that help us explore the intricate and subterranean pathways of our contemporary situation and its ideological formations. The lecture that Professor Dolar will present today is titled On Ontology and Its Glitches. As usual, there will be a Q&A after the lecture, as well as a reception outside, and you're all kindly invited to stick around and have a conversation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Dolar.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you, Florian, first of all. I think I was here at Princeton. I think I spoke about 3 times so far. Each of those occasions were very memorable. I cherish the memory of them, and I'm very elated to come back, always elated to come back to Princeton. I have developed friendships here. It's a place where I think my ideas have a certain resonance, and it has always been very engaging and productive for me. So for today's lecture, I'm afraid I'm imposing a rather difficult lecture, ambitious and difficult, on a single word, which is the word on. And okay, to choose the topic of ontology and address it head on is a sort of perilous enterprise. It's a bit crazy. On the one hand, it's supposedly clear that psychoanalysis, and this is the quote as I'm coming from, should stay clear of ontology and even of philosophy at large, given Freud's and Lacan's adamant pronouncements against philosophy as such, against the big danger of psychoanalysis becoming another philosophical current. And ontology is supposed to be the epitome of what is problematic in philosophy, maybe its perverse core, given its heavy metaphysical luggage. On the other hand, there is no doing away with ontology. For having done away with it, it has a nasty tendency to keep coming back, to keep haunting. And we'll come back to haunting. Can one escape ontology? If ontology is the wrong way of speaking about being, one can propose its subversion and other ways. Still, one cannot escape an engagement with being which has ontological consequences. Is ontology one of these entities that one cannot negate? One runs the risk of, this is not my mother, the Freudian. This is not ontology. I guess there is a false alternative between, on the one hand, we must abandon ontology, it's doomed, it drags with it the metaphysical gear, let's go somewhere else. And on the other hand, we must do proper ontology, maintain and improve its standards. What one should attempt to do is rather to address its emphasis, show fidelity to what insists inside its tradition, without espousing its framework. Just as Lacan, with all his harsh pronouncements against philosophy, and he said at some point, it's certain it's a finished thing, nevertheless engages with it on virtually every page, tackling its real, its symptoms and impulses, without subscribing to its outfit. I will take an unusual cue as the starting point, a literary cue, namely Samuel Beckett's Wurst but Ho, a text from 1983, one of my cult texts. And I will take just its very short first paragraph and even just its first word. This is one of the most extreme texts of literary modernism, sort of the terminal stage of modernism. And I will just remind you that Beckett died in 1989, John Cage, Francis Bacon, and Olivier Messiaen died in 1992, coincided with the fall of the Iron Curtain. It seems like that was the end of an epoch. But psychoanalysis is inscribed in this epoch of modernism. From Kafka to Beckett, from Duchamp to Bacon, from Schoenberg to Cage, it shares its fate with it. So in Wurst but Ho, we have this extreme shriveling, the withering away of art, the reduction of form. And Beckett was the man of n-1. There can always be less. For any n, you can still cut off. You can reduce it. And one of his texts is actually called Lessness. Until we get to what he calls the unknowable least, which is maybe an excellent vantage point from which to examine the tricky topic of ontology. Now this text is stunning, but I can only deal with it very shortly here. It would demand a lot of reflection. I will just make a couple of comments to situate it. The title, Wurst but Ho, is obviously caught on West but Ho, which was the traditional call of boatmen on the River Thames. This call was used a number of times, and the first literary piece called West but Ho is actually by John Webster in Shakespeare's time. And among several others, there's a famous novel, West but Ho by Charles Kingsley in the 19th century, which Beckett knew very well. And there is finally, a Western with John Wayne called West but Ho. So the call is laden with the prospect of finding new life which lies westward. Go west, young man. And the general direction of our Western civilization. And just a little twist is needed to turn it into Wurst but Ho, to change the direction. Go worst, young man. Heading for the worst, against the idea of progress, which is the core narrative of the Enlightenment. We're supposed to be heading for the best. The core narrative of progress could perhaps be encapsulated in the injunction, bestward ho, echoing Beckett's title. And one should remember Lacan's adage, progress is the hypothesis of the master. From the vantage point of the title, one could proceed to something that one could call the ontology of the worst. It's not a path I will follow, but I can just mention as a teaser two of Beckett's sources for this. And one is Byron's line from his epic poem Lara. This runs like this: "The worst is ever nearest truth." It's a very simple line. And the other one is from Shakespeare's King Lear. I quote, "The worst is not, so long as we can say this is the worst." And this goes far. Language is a sort of protection, like a buffer in relation to what it evokes. But does it also go for being? But as I said, I will not pursue this line. I have written about it as well. I will concentrate merely on the beginning, on the first line, and more narrowly on the first word of the first line. So here is the beginning of Verse But Co, the first short paragraph, a very meager starting point to tackle our problem of ontology. It runs like this: on, say on, be said on, somehow on, till know-how on, said know-how on. That's all. Know-how spelled N-O-H-O-W. There's a pun. So let me just stop on the first word, this strange first word, which is on, and make a series of comments. A number of key lines of thought coincide in this simple short word. Now first, well, obviously for the immediate entry into ontology, on is obviously Greek for being, technically the present participle of the verb eine, to be. The first word can be read as an interlinguistic pun. And here we first come across the topic of puns and ontology. Not merely language and ontology, which is the problem of long-standing, starting with logos, which is the word, the fundamental foundational word, establishing this big other of logos. Not that, but the puns, which are the slippages of logos, the contingent homonymies, the chance encounters of sounds, something that seemingly runs counter the stringency and universal claims of ontology. And the psychoanalytic take on logos should proceed from there. The capacity of language for punning and for homonymies, rather than capacity of language for making sense. And to make it quick, there is no unconscious without homonymy, without the slippages of logos, without these puns, the wordplays, no unconscious without punning. But this slippage of logos, when it comes to the fore and unconscious, has ontological consequences. Now philosophy famously started with on, with Aristotle notorious to on, he on, being qua being, the first word, the founding word of ontology, a term which is derived from on. And I just briefly quote the famous beginning of Book Gamma of Metaphysics. This is what Aristotle says: "There is a science which investigates being qua being, and the attributes which belong to this in virtue of its own nature." Now this is not the same as any of so-called special sciences, for none of these other sciences treats universally of being as being. They cut off a part of being and investigate the attribute of this part. So this is the highest science, but actually Aristotle never called it ontology. He rather used the term first philosophy. And as I was surprised to learn when preparing for this lecture, curiously, the first mention of ontology, the word ontology, this is a Neo-Latin compound in 1606. That's very late. In Ordua Scholastica by Jacob Lorchard, and the first English mention is from 1664. So, astoundingly, this is a retroactive masterword. We think that philosophy since ever has been about ontology, but the word is actually a later compound. So this is what ontology is supposed to be, considering being not from any particular angle or quality or use or bias, but merely qua being, like being and nothing more, being only being and nothing but being. From Aristotle's to on, up to Hegel's being, pure being, which is the notorious beginning of his logic. These are the two milestones of ontology, encompassing more than 2 millennia of philosophy, of the grand metaphysical tradition. Being, like the masterword of philosophy, or maybe it's MacGuffin, if you know what MacGuffin is. And I'm taking this from actually this wonderful title by Hans Blumenberg, Being a MacGuffin. This is his review of Heidegger, written actually for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, for the German Central Daily. Lacan, always wary of philosophy, promoting anti-philosophy, was nevertheless, occasionally at least, skeptical about the story of the end of metaphysics. In a quite different spirit, he made a comment on Aristotle's Metaphysic and on this particular passage, calling it a magnificent text. I quote, "For everything started from there. It's absolutely fabulous. They speak about the end of metaphysics, but in the name of what? As long as that book is there, one will always be able to do it." End of quote. So there's the persistent nature of ontology metaphysics versus the quick getting rid of it. Now, I come to my first point. Should the Greek on be read as the English on? What's the connection between the two? Is being inherently tied with on, as an injunction? Perhaps this contingent encounter, this pun, this minimal example of what Lacan called la langue, points to something far-reaching and essential. On, in English, in this opening position, the first word is an imperative, while the Greek on is a substantivized verb, a participle, seemingly only stating what is, seemingly neutral and innocent. But here is the crux of the matter. For Lacan, being is never just based on an assertion that it is, but always involves an imperative dimension if concealed. On the one hand, there is an imperative hiding under the apparent constative, and this is what Lacan aims at when he says that being in ontology is always, in French he says, l'être à la botte, l'être aux ordres, which is translated as being at the heel, being at someone's beck and call, something that ultimately inscribes the discourse on being into the discourse of the master. This is his central thesis about ontology. I quote, "Every dimension of being is produced in the wake of master's discourse, the discourse of he who, preferring the signifier, expects therefrom one of its link effects that must not be neglected, which is related to the fact that the signifier commands. The signifier is first and foremost imperative." So there's a hidden command lying under what seems to be a mere assertion, the most universal and neutral statement of all, stating merely that being is, and seemingly asserting the most universal property of what is. There is what Lacan called S1, a master signifier, supporting this universality of being, a hidden master signifier, a suppressed master signifier that sustains being as the masterword of philosophy. So there is an incipient problem of ontology and politics, or ontology and its inscription in the forms of domination. And here is the whole passage from Lacan. This is from Seminar 20, 1972-73. Ontology is what highlighted in language the use of the copula, isolating it as a signifier. To dwell on the verb to be, a verb that is not even in the complete field of the diversity of languages employed in a way we could qualify as universal. And here I just point to this reference in Benveniste. I don't know if you know Benveniste. There's a famous paper, The Categories of Language, Categories of Thought. Benveniste was a linguist, pointing out that being can only be conceived, well, in some special languages, but this is not universal at all. There are ever so many languages which cannot even, don't have a word for being. So that Aristotle's categories are actually strangely linked to the categories of Greek grammar. So what is the relation between forms of thought and linguistic forms which are available to express this thought? So being is a Greek problem, and we are bound by this. Okay, to dwell on the verb to be, to produce it as such, is a highly risky enterprise. In order to exorcise it, not exercise, but exorcise it, it might perhaps suffice to suggest that when we say about anything whatsoever that it is what it is, nothing in any way obliges us to isolate the verb to be. In this use of the copula, we would see nothing at all. We would see nothing whatsoever if a discourse, the discourse of the master, of maître, didn't emphasize the verb to be, which is être. And here we have another pun, a French pun. I mean, maître, which is M' être, and maître as the master. They sound the same. They sound the same. But technically, M' être, maître, is a reflexive form of the verb to be. Like to be oneself, but not in the sense be yourself, this sort of injunction of identity, which is deeply against the grain of psychoanalysis, but like in to wash oneself, or to introduce oneself, to prepare oneself. And this is quite a brilliant pun. To be is not a reflexive verb. It's not an action that can reflexively turn back on the subject, like washing. Well, not an action at all. It's intransitive. And only transitive verbs with an object can turn back on the subject. And Lacan's point is that by isolating the copula and turning it into being, one sort of reflexively makes it turn upon itself. One isolates it in its self-reflexivity, which happens to coincide with the word for master, for maître. It takes the master to turn to be into this reflexive verb. And maybe this is a paramount gesture of the master, inaugurating ontology. The delusional belief of being the master of myself, of being me to myself, maître à moi-même, which always involved a thwarted attempt at mastering the universe as one. And mark this sequence: I, one, universe, the totalization of being as one. So there is a tension that gets repressed in the neutrality of being as a mere reference and designation. It's not a description, a statement, a constatation. There is always an implicit imperative, something of the order of an order. The ordering nature of the signifier gets obfuscated. With the notion of being, it's like isolating a connective element and turning it into this entity while purifying it of the traces of the imperative, exorcising, says Lacan. Now, can one get rid of this imperative dimension of the signifier, which inscribes then ontology into the discourse of the master, this hidden sting of an order? Can there be another discourse on being that would circumvent this Aristotelian constellation, that would be rid of the master? Now I think Beckett, and this is why I started with Beckett. Beckett is really an excellent guide here. He's the writer, to make it very simple, he's the writer of insistence rather than of existence. The insistence of English on versus the existence of Greek on. If you are to take seriously this amalgamation of the two ons, then Beckett's on as if exposes the pure imperative, making explicit the hidden dimension. The whole project of ontology is perhaps suspended between these two versions of on. There is an imperative dimension of being that doesn't take its support in asserting the being that is, and that can thus be established as the most universal category, but rather refers to something in being, something, be it something or nothing, says Beckett. Something in being that implies a call, an injunction, an imperative, aiming at something that is not yet being. And one can show fidelity to this dimension only by persevering, by continuing, by following the insisting on. Something that perhaps will have been, and did we must take on by sheer persistence, something that is not yet, but pertains only to the mode of English on, at the very place of on as being. Something, I guess, impossible, and yet it insists. And hence, if you know Beckett's famous The Unnameable, the famous ending of The Unnameable is, you must go on, I can't go on, I'll go on. This is the last line of The Unnameable. In the face of the master's discourse, it presents the existence of the impossible as something that one has to take upon oneself as a subject. This is not, let's be rid of the imperative of S1 of the master signify, let's take things such as they present themselves. It's rather, things don't just present themselves. Okay, that would be Heidegger's Gelassenheit, that let be, releasement. They address us, we address them, we are part and parcel of being, which can only be sustained by perseverance, a perseverance fundamental to any cognitive engagement. So there will be an ethical dimension to this ontology, dimension of on. Beckett's on, as encapsulated in the Greek on, is closely related to this famous Lacanian adage, not to give way as to one's desire, the psychoanalytic injunction from the Seminar 7. Yeah, and even closer to something that one could call the ethics of the drive, the sheer persistence of the drive. One must turn oneself into the agent of this persistence. There's the danger of this rather romantic take on the heroism of desire, but as opposed to this, the drive is impersonal. It's a pressure, a push, an urge, and on is perhaps the minimal linguistic form of the drive. Like one could say, I drive, speak, as Carlton, this famous Lacanian, I truth speak. If the drive could speak, what would it say? Well, it would say on. On as opposed to the master signifier. Now, what is this gap in being that demands on? Well, it's the gap that pertains to inherent negativity inscribed in being. And I'm coming to my second point. The second point is very simple. On is the inversion of no. And this was Beckett's favorite wordplay. This is the second pun, or rather the second anagram. On in the place of no. Just change two letters. A persistence premised on negativity, through negativity, via negativity, as the shift of negativity. It's reversed at the very same place. And the beauty of it, if this is indeed the word, is the absolute minimalism. On and no occupy the same spot, with the inversion of just two letters. And if I say anagram, one can draw on the straight tradition of Saussure's obsessions with anagrams, which was the first emergence of, la langue within the Saussurean la langue. On the one hand, the differentiality and clear-cut pure difference versus this chance encounter grafted upon language, chance encounter of letters and sounds. And one interpreter, Levin Brown, who's written on Beckett and Lacan, actually a very nice book, gives a good comment on this. I quote, "The no, which expresses the impossibility of advancing, and the on, which designates the extreme urgency to move forward, are both equally constraining, imposing themselves on the subject in a univocal manner, allowing for no concession or dialectical compromise. These two antonyms offer no possibilities but compose a dilemma centered on an impossible." Okay, end of quote. And well, anecdotically, Beckett wrote Where's What Ho in English? And when pushed to translate it into French, he gave up. Because most of the texts written in English, he translated into French himself. And most of the texts he wrote in French in the first place. Well, he didn't feel capable of doing it. It's so intimately connected with this English la langue, the nature of this small word on. It just grows out of this singular constellation. So the French translation was then done by someone else, by Edith Fournier, published after his death. There's no way to get this minimalism in any other language. So how did the French translator tackle this? I quote this beginning in French. Encore, dire encore, soit dit encore. And you can see, it's not the same at all, but except for that there is something gained in translation. Encore, this is precisely the title of Lacan's seminar, of this 20 seminar we are dealing with. Encore to be read as an injunction. And I can add here Beckett's own reflections on negation. This is in his conversation with Charles Juliet in 1968. And I will not be able to comment on this properly here. I just quote it. He says, negation is not possible, no more than affirmation. It is absurd to say that it is absurd. There is still to express a value judgment. One cannot protest and one cannot consent. And then, after a long silence, we have to stand where there is no possible pronoun, no solution, no reaction, no taking of position. This is what makes the work so diabolically difficult. End of quote. So, there is a being that can be neither affirmed nor denied. Is this unknowable least that creeps in and keeps persisting, even if one wants to push to the end this negativity. There is negativity, there is a negativity to start with. Is this no preceding the on. But negation also never quite succeeds. It has to be repeated over and over. Something resists, but something created by negation itself, not something prior. Negation creates something that it cannot negate. And unknowable least is beyond negation and affirmation. It's being on the verge of non-being. So there is an on that subtends the deployment of meaning, a push, a thrust, a drive, the manifestation of this inherent negativity. And I'm coming to my third point. One can read on not merely as an English word or a Greek word, but also as a French word. And Beckett having written the bulk of his work in French. With Beckett, one is always on a shifting ground between languages. And in French is the impersonal pronoun, like man in German. In English, the closest would be like one. On croirait que one would believe that. But on is precisely not one, not as a countable entity, it's uncountable. Etymologically, on stems from homme, from man. It's a shriveled, shrunken form of man. It is the impersonal third person, the unspecified third person. On dit que, people say, or rumor has it. And this is a wonderful expression, rumor has it. You know, there's this mystical, strange it in this expression. It speaks. The general background, the buzz of language being spoken, like man in Heidegger, who turned it into a category. Now, the third person is not a person. And here again I follow Benveniste in his famous paper on division of these persons, grammatical division. And his line is that it's a non-person, it's extracted from the speech situation where there is an interchange between an I and a you, interlocutors with exchangeable places. The third person is absent from the speech situation, it's disentangled, it's extricated from the form of address, from the present interlocutors. It refers to the absence. So, ontology in this sense, based on the French on, depends on the impersonal, a language detached from the exchange between the first and the second person. This can cut both ways. First, it can function as concealing the first person behind the facade of an impersonal on, masking the I behind the on being like I in disguise, an I that can present itself as neutral, as mingled in the crowd of on. Or else, the second alternative, it can pave the way to an absolution from the I, a release, a liberation from the cage of centrality and the privilege of I, the privilege of the first person singular as the referential point, as in cogito sum, thus rejoining the dimension of what language initially and fundamentally is, a realm of it speaks. There is speech. There are various formulations of this. In Foucault, you have this language speaks before an I assumes it in the first person singular. I comes late in the vocabulary. Children have trouble in assuming it. It's an indexical expression that requires a complex operation, an empty spot that anyone can occupy. It has no reference outside of speech iteration. I is the one who says I. And I follow again Benveniste. This is the only definition, says Benveniste. You cannot describe I in other terms. So there's a fundamental alienation in language before there can be a privatization, an appropriation of language. One could say I is the privatization of on can function as a hidden possession and appropriation based on the concealment of I, or as opposed to this, it can function as a dispossession of the I, its expropriation. An ontology in this sense, based on the French, on should properly be placed in this latter dimension, to be extricated from the master discourse. For this, the former, the concealed I, is precisely the hidden gesture of the master, the gesture of, if you remember 5 minutes ago, maître, this self-reflexive verb, self-reflexive turn of the verb to be, which is ultimately the basis of I. I'm coming to my fourth point. On is an injunction to continue. And in the immediate sense, one can read it as actually as a continuation of the end of the unnameable. This famous end, I can't go on, I'll go on. Like exactly 30 years later, Unnameable is 1953, Wordsworth Ho is 1983. Exactly 30 years later, Beckett resumes with on, with the word with which he finished this famous novel 30 years ago. So he resumes its thrust 30 years on. On is a repetition of on in his work. It's still on. But given that on is the first word, we start here with a continuation. In the beginning, there is a continuation. If one says on, something must have preceded formally, so that one can then go on. There is structurally a prolongation and an extension. It is as if we start with the second, not with the first. But what has preceded? There is no something that preceded this on. No something that would simply exist prior to this on. No first to have preceded second. It's like created retroactively by on, by this urge to, this injunction to continue. So it's both suppressed and both brought forth by it. Maybe this constellation can be taken as exemplary. I think it has the structure of what Freud has called the primary repression, Urverdrängung, the suppression of something that didn't exist prior to this suppression. You see the paradox. The first is already the second retroactively creates an unfathomable first, which went lost, was never present as such. So on is like a response to a question that was never asked. It only retroactively creates its precedent. And now, after these four sort of points, I come to my central thesis, as it were. This is a dramatic moment. The proposal of a new branch of philosophy, a new field of research, and guess what it's called? It's called on-tology. See what I mean? On-tology. And it is based on 5 features of the word on. First and second, the Greek and the English, it shamelessly conflates the Greek and the English word. It's based on this short circuit of Lanon, this cross-linguistic short circuit. It presents a counterpart to the classical ontology, bringing out its hidden imperative and declaring it, but not in the form of a master's order disguising itself as a neutral statement, rather aiming at the point where being is not quite being, not quite itself, not simply present, not finished and completed, but calling for the subject's engagement of an on. And the third, there is the inversion on no, pointing to the inherent negativity in being. And fourth, there is the French on is impersonal, it speaks. And finally, on as the second without the first, the continuation that creates its precedent. So you see what I mean? I want to read this on as a not. Really, this is another pun. Somehow one can't escape punning. Read it whichever way you want. One could propose cutting the knot in both senses. It tries to be faithful to the universality of being, such as propounded by the tradition of ontology. It doesn't simply give up on it, but it displays at the very same place, and by extremely minimum means, the dimensions that inherently escape that tradition, or rather were repressed by it. Or shall one say that on is the symptom of being? The glitches of logos exposed by punning, which may seem a very trivial pursuit, punning is a low kind of humor, but one should perhaps speak about, okay, transcendental punning, something that affects being or touches being in the very contingency of the encounter. So, being and punning. This could be an alternative title for this talk. Ontology produces an unbehagen, a discontent, an unease, a malaise. Ontology and its discontent. This could be yet another title for this talk. It has the bad reputation of something belonging to the metaphysical past, profoundly enmeshed with it. One should get out of its cage, but it strangely persists, not easy to shake it off. Indeed, as if true to its English version of as on, persisting despite its demise and disrepute, living its afterlife, after its high standing during the supposed metaphysical life. The minimal alteration of its name should mark the distance, and the more minimal the difference, the better this seems to do the job. On-tology, in place of ontology, with the amalgamation of English, Greek, and French, the reversal of on and no, and the minimalism of the hyphen, like hyphen as a scar of being, a gap, bringing up all the suppressed problems of enunciation, hidden injunction, the underlying ethical imperative, the nature of the signifier, the impersonality of language, the subject emerging at the gap of being, repression, originary negativity before there is something to negate, or a -1 at the outset, a negativity preceding on and coinciding with this pun, this anagram of on and no. It's like an attempt to address some big metaphysical, ontological problems by the means of punning, a trifle in comparison with the magnitude of the seriousness of the problems. Ultimately, the stringency of the concept would thus coincide with the contingency of punning. There would be no contradiction between the two. The stringency of the concept would grow out of the contingency of punning. And well, my hyphen proposal actually echoes and intersects with the conceptualization of the dash proposed by Frank Ruda and Rebecca Comey in the book called Dash. Now, can pun be turned into a concept? I would actually propose a new concept, which is puncept. And when I was writing this, I thought I invented a new English word in line with what I was saying, but the word exists, to my surprise. It was actually invented by Gregory Ulmer, and it comes as no surprise that he's a Derrida scholar. So I think it's a good term, puncept. You see what I mean? Combining the complete contingency, but nevertheless the claim to universality, which points out this pun dimension lying low in every concept, to its dimension of contingency, this chance encounter or nature of a glitch. And I will just make a remark that actually the one who started down this road was Hegel. Ever so many of his concepts actually depend on a German pun. If you take Urteil, if you take Wahrnehmung, if you take Was für ein, or above all, if you take Aufhebung, the central German, the central Hegelian concept, which just depends on the contingency of it having three different meanings in German and coinciding in one word. So it was actually Hegel who already introduced at the height of the metaphysics, the end of the metaphysics, if you wish, concepts. I mean, so many of his concepts can actually be read as concepts. And he was adamant, he resisted, opposed the artificial philosophical language, what he called the philosophische Kunstsprache, like the formal logic. His logic is rather the opposite of formal logic. It depends on these natural resources of the natural, the resources, the metaphysical, the speculative resources of the natural language itself. Okay, I won't go into Hegel at all. Now, okay, I'm coming to the second part. I hope you're with me. And so before I go on, I'll just make a quick general remark that I'm bracketing off, I'm consciously bracketing off another line of approach to ontology, which doesn't seem to be affected by discontent, or rather proposes to be rid of it by circumventing these paradoxes and addressing reality by bypassing the negativity of the signifying cut. There is, namely, the massive wave of return to ontology that largely circumvents these problems under the labels of speculative realism, new materialisms, object-oriented ontology, vibrant matter relying on neurosciences, cognitivism in many parts. And they propose to be rid of this structuralist, post-structuralist, postmodern framework of discursivity at large, and beyond that with the linguistic turn that shaped so much of modern philosophy. One should return to the world outside discursivity, the great outside, the democracy of objects, a world that would do away with the privilege of the subject, the central privilege of the human existence over the existence of the non-human. One should go back to the world beyond correlationism and its cage. And a number of proposals within this growing and diverse current would deserve a serious engagement. But that would demand another paper. So I can just very briefly say that a lot of it can be reduced to the formula which was proposed by my friend Alenka Zupancic. The formula, imagine the world without me. Imagine there is a world of objects without me, which is pure fantasy. Fantasy of, let me observe the world where I'm absent, where I'm not in central position. And a lot of it relies on the forced alternative between everything is discursive, which is the religious post-structuralist stance, versus there is a real beyond discursivity and the subject, an alternative which I think one shouldn't subscribe to at all. And well, I just can here reiterate my basic assumption that the problem of ontology ultimately always depends on the paradoxes produced by the signifier, its cut and negativity, the real it produces, the surplus, and the subject it involves. Okay, this is just a side remark, that I'm conscious that I'm limitation of this paper. I'm bracketing off certain problems. Now, this is not the first such attempt. One has to mention an illustrious predecessor, namely Derrida's proposal of ontology. Again, using the capacity of language for punning, contingent consonants, rather the capacity to produce unitary meaning, regardless of the sound value of words. Homonymy versus synonymy. But this is what the logic of the unconscious depends on, as I already said. No formations of the unconscious without homonymy. And the unconscious is precisely this tiny crack of logos that has ontological consequences. Okay, I devote a brief section to Derrida. I think that it's appropriate, actually. The Derrida archive is here in Princeton, and I would like to pay my homage to Derrida. I'm not at the reading, but I have learned such a lot from Derrida. So the French word for this is ontology, ontology from ente, it's H-N-T-O, to haunt. And the etymology comes from Old Norse heimta, to bring home, to return home. Hence it acquired the meaning of ghosts returning home to the place where they once lived. The verb, by its origin, evokes heim, home, and hence das Unheimliche, the uncanny, Freud's notion of the uncanny, which is indeed central to ontology. It's like its home ground, precisely dehoming its home ground. Derrida famously proposed the term in his Spectres of Marx in 1993, the book where he made his stand on Marx and Marxism after the downfall of socialist regimes and the seeming demise of Marxism. And for haunting, he didn't have to look far. The notorious first line of the Communist Manifesto runs, "The spectre is haunting Europe," the spectre of communism. This is probably the most famous line ever proposed by Marx. And there's the whole Shakespearean context of this apparition of the ghost, the big case that Derrida made of Hamlet. So Marx's idea in the manifesto is precisely how the ghost, this ghost of the spectre of communism that has been haunting already for a while, should now manifest itself, hence the manifesto. What has been present as a ghostly spectre now takes the word. It declares its goals, intentions, its program, and briefly the proposal of manifesto is, I, ghost, speak. No more haunting. The spectre should be dispelled, it should enter the bright daylight and do away with spectrality. Derrida used the term ontology only 3 times in the whole book, and strategically placed at the beginning, towards the middle, and at the end. But this new word was an instant success. It spread very quickly. Now, ontology is larger than ontology, and the returning of ghosts, specters, the insistence of this return, this coming back, this revenant, its on, points to a dimension of haunting that is precisely something that cannot be inscribed into Hamlet's alternative of to be or not to be. In the seemingly exhaustive opposition between to be or not to be, it doesn't obey the law of the excluded middle, of the tertium mandatum. It neither is nor is not. It is irreducible to either presence or absence. It's neither being nor nothing. It haunts both. It points to that in being which is not mere being, being that doesn't coincide with itself. It doesn't present itself in full presence. And one could say, haunting is the proof that there is something rotten in the country of being. And you know that Derrida's famous term was metaphysics of presence, which can be read as a pleonasm. Metaphysics ultimately always relies on having to deal with an unalloyed presence. And haunting has all the makings of the return of something originally and structurally repressed, quite beyond the particular ghost of the particular king murdered by his brother. And I quote, well, the second of the 3 passages, this is Derrida, haunting doesn't belong to ontology, to the discourse of being of beings, or to the essence of life and death. It requires then what we call, to save time and space rather than just to make up a word, ontology. I love this. Let's just save time. We will take this category to be irreducible, and first of all, to everything that makes possible, to everything it makes possible, to ontology, theology, positive or negative ontotheology. End of quote. So ontology, just to save time and space, not just because of the pun and the incisive short circuit between sound and sense. But the pun, well, which may be a sideshow, is nevertheless essential. It's not that haunting is auxiliary, derivative, and secondary in relation to being, and this is Derrida's big theme, that the derivative undermines the origin. It is fundamental. Any being sort of appears only against the backdrop of haunting, framed by a suppression. Haunting is repetition, the coming back of something that went before, like a symptom, something that allegedly used to be present. But the radical implication is that its past alleged firm presence may have always already been spectral or retroactively produced by the advent of presence. And here is briefly the third passage. To haunt doesn't mean to be present, and it is necessary to introduce haunting into the very construction of a concept, of every concept, beginning with the concept of being and time. That is what we would call here a hauntology. Ontology opposes it only in a movement of exorcism. Ontology is a conjuration. So this is the grand design behind this word, with the grand ambition. There is hauntology underlying every concept, the very possibility of formation of concepts, the part that conceptuality as such represses, a ghost that cannot be laid to rest. This is a book that deals with Marx, and spectrality doesn't enter Marx's universe only as a ghost of communism to be manifested. There is also a structural spectrality in Marx that pertains to the world of commodities as such. Commodities are the bearers of a ghost-like presence. There is spectrality inherent to the commodity world as such. And Marx's notion of commodity fetishism aims precisely at this. And you know, one of Marx's most famous sentences in the beginning of the chapter on fetishism, I quote, "A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties." Voll metaphysischer Spitzfindigkeit und theologischer Mucken. So the moment we try to grasp it, metaphysics and theology enter the scene. A practical, everyday metaphysics and theology pertaining to economy. Metaphysical and theological dimension is irreducible to its material, physical, trivial presence, hence haunting. It's not the metaphysical and theological elevated, lofty realm of ideas and chimeras that is the problem. The problem is the practical, embodied metaphysics that makes the bodily disembodied, as it were. A dimension of spectrality is the proof that we are living in a topsy-turvy, alienated world. So the conclusion Marx draws from this is the same as above. Spectrality should disappear. It's merely the token of the commodity universe. Let's do away with the ghosts. Let things be what they are. Let them coincide with themselves and their materiality. Let them be liberated from this spectral yoke. Let them shine in the wealth of their multifaceted, sensuous, material presence and multiple usage, instead of them being uniformized by the commodity form. But this is not the line that Derrida takes. He praises Marx for conceptualizing haunting, but parts ways with him as to its sense. Here the ambiguity of the project of ontology becomes apparent. And naively, is haunting a good thing or a bad thing? Should it be done away with and good riddance? Of course not. Of course it's bound with the repression and return of the repressed, and it's bound with the commodity universe that both Marx and Derrida are set to expose to harsh criticism. But for Derrida, the dimension of haunting is irreducible, a dimension that ontology, ultimately every ontology, attempts to reduce, materialist ontology in particular. There is, this is a very simplistic way of putting it, authentic spectrality we should show fidelity to, attempt to preserve, hold on to, pursue. As to commodity universe, it is rather a massive perversion of this dimension, its misuse, its falsification. But by doing away with it, getting rid of it, One doesn't thereby make disappear haunting as such. One doesn't reduce things to their immediate coincidence with themselves. For if one succeeded in this, one would cease to be human. Ontology is the symptom of ontology, but it is also what can save us from ontology, although it can be pursued only in an oblique way, not as a program. And what Derrida aims at with ontology goes in the same direction as the Freud's take on the uncanny, the famous paper on the uncanny from 1919, and indeed Derrida refers to it a lot, both explicitly and implicitly. So already in Freud, you have this uncertainty of apparition, of the limit between life and death, between being and non-being, between inside and outside. So Derrida very much relies on Freud's uncanny. The project of ontology appears like its extension of this psychoanalytic take. And indeed it can be taken as another entry into my argument about being and punning. But there is one crucial difference where the ways part, and to put it in a nutshell, again this would demand another paper. Freud sees the uncanny ultimately as the manifestation of the castration complex. One of his instances is indeed dissecta membra, the cut off limbs, most literally evoking castration, but also his other instances, the double as the figure of castration, the undead, etc. And this is not the consequence that Derrida would be willing to take. He tends to see it merely as a prolongation of, say, phallocentrism, phallologocentrism. This is the gist of his critique of psychoanalysis. And this is where, well, psychoanalysis is extraordinary. He maintains that the question of this negativity, this minus one, the inherent negativity inscribed of being, is immediately linked with a pound of flesh, as it were, the cut in the body. It implies the question of jouissance. It links the abstract notions of negativity with the contingency, the triviality, the baseness, let's say, of the human body. The body is the cut in the body. The body submitted to signifying cut. So its point is rather to expose the contingency of what held in check the tradition that can be described as, say, phallocentric, while Derrida would merely see this as a sublated continuation of it, not its critique. But psychoanalysis adamantly insists on this particular name, castration, as the flip side of the more abstract and seemingly elevated terms like negativity, haunting, or minus one. Now I'm coming to the final twist, the final last twist of this, being and punning, as it were. There is one more pun concerning ontology, and it was proposed by Lacan. The pun only works in French. It's called ontology. Ontology is spelled with an H, H-O-N-T, if you see what I mean. Ontology, only this works in French because it's based on the connection with la honte, which in French is shame. So ontology and shame, here's our last topic. So what is the connection between ontology and shame, apart from the pun? The pun is sort of ready-made, and Lacan comes back to it several times. He says at some point, ontologie est une honte. Ontology is shame. But the proper place of origin of this ontologie is Anvers, the other side of psychoanalysis, precisely the seminar that introduces the theory of the four discourses, the seminar in the wake of May 68, the most political of all seminars. And the question of shame has its political connotations. It comes up in the last session of the seminar. This is June 1970. I will make just two quick points, the beginning and the end of this session. There are many other things I should comment on, but okay. Now, the opening sentence of this session is, it does have to be said that it is unusual to die of shame. Very strange opening salvo. So, what does it mean? People don't die of shame, at least not anymore. Not like somebody called François Vatel, whom Lacan mentions in that session, who was the butler of Prince Condé, who was to organize a big 3-day feast to which all the court was invited in 1678, and he ordered 12 shipments of seafood, fish, etc., but only 2 arrived. So as a consequence, he was overcome by unbearable shame and committed suicide. And allegedly, his dead body was discovered just when someone came to tell him that the fish had finally arrived. So people did die of shame. People did die for honor, which Lacan connects with la honte, with shame. Although I think it's a slightly different problem. If one doesn't die of shame, it may have to do with the withering of the big other. There is no more shame of disproportion. The big other has dwindled. And as a consequence, there is an increase of shamelessness. This is 1970. And there, I mean, the entry point seems strange, but then Lacan proposes a reflexive formula of shame, which I think is very good. On the basis of this first statement, namely that the shame is ultimately the shame of not having died of shame. See what I mean? That one has survived the situation, and this is what one is ashamed of, or should have died. So there's a redoubled shame. One would rather die, but one didn't. There's the shame of having survived dying of shame, the shame of survival, the exposure in the very survival. The shame doesn't pertain to one falling short of the demand, of not living up to the injunction, the superior, let's say, or being lacking in the eyes of the other. This is rather guilt. And to make it quick, guilt has to do with a lack and desire. And one can take guilt upon oneself, even if one is technically not guilty, like Oedipus. Shame rather has to do with jouissance, with the fact that one is thrown into a situation that one cannot take upon oneself. One is exposed in the very being. It produces physiological effects, like blushing. I have a wonderful passage in Darwin on the question of blushing, being specifically human. Shame pertains to something too much, which should go away but doesn't, cannot. The shame of still being there, although one would want to vanish. One is exposed in one's contingent being and enjoyment, not covered by the signifier, exposing the affect of the signifying cut. And there is a strange connection with the question of the uncanny, with the logic of haunting. With the uncanny, something has come to light that should have remained hidden. This is actually Schelling's definition of the uncanny that Freud relies on. It is the only definition that he agrees with, that something has come to light that should have remained hidden. And this comes to light, and this is then the apparition which is incongruous with the objective world where it appears like a ghost. This is what makes it uncanny. Whereas with shame, one could say that we are ourselves that apparition. We cannot be disentangled from it. We are the locus of disclosure, helplessly tied to our bodies, blushing, wanting to die. What should have remained hidden? There is the exposure of precisely this contingency of our being, of our arbitrary tie to the signifying cut and its concomitant jouissance. There is what John Kopjek has actually spoken about. It's introduced this term. There is the notion of ontological shame. There's ontological shame, which pertains to being exposed in the contingency of our being. And this is not merely our bare life, but rather the fact that our life is never quite bare. It is being exposed. So this is the first sentence, the entry into this session, and I'm just coming to my conclusion. Now I will just come to the last sentence of the session, the parting shot. I quote, if there are some reasons for your presence here in such numbers, and you know that Lacan seminar was attended by vast masses of people. Actually, I had the privilege to attend some of his last seminars. It was impossible to get in. You have to queue for 2 hours. So if there is some reason for your presence here in such numbers, if this phenomenon takes place, which is frankly incomprehensible to me, given what it is that I put forward for the majority of you, and you know it's pretty difficult, what Lacan spoke about is rather strange that masses of people come to this extremely difficult discourse. So if there are some reasons for your presence, etc., it is because I happen to make you ashamed. Not too much, but just enough. So this is the last sentence of this session, the last sentence of the seminar. C'est que pas trop, mais justement assez, il m'arrive de vous faire honte. Thus Lacan, at the very end, places himself as someone whose function, duty, or role it is to make his audience a little bit ashamed, to introduce shame in a shameless time, to make himself an agent of the absent big other. This is directly opposed to the general injunction of postmodern times, like, don't be ashamed of yourself. There is nothing to be ashamed of. Be yourself. Don't be ashamed of your enjoyment. Quite the opposite. There is like a superego injunction to enjoy. And the counterpart, the flip side of this, is precisely shaming the other, right? Which functions so easily in this, what is now called the cancel culture. So keeping the dimension of shame can be seen as Lacan's analytic intervention. He intervenes in a situation where shamelessness is on the surge, and this may be a major sign of the time. He addresses shamelessness on both sides. The increasing shamelessness of the figures of power, but also of the insurgents, of the revolutionaries, of the protesters, who were betting on transgression, on jouir sans entrave, enjoy without impediments, and there is nothing to be ashamed of. Also on the part of the left, the protesters, that this discourse was going on. So shamelessness seems to propose the lifting of repression, lifting the veil, and this has taken enormous proportions since, with the obscene, hidden side of power coming to light in grand ways shamelessly. But this is the very opposite. This is the new way in which repression itself gets repressed. This is not the lifting of repression, but the way that repression itself gets repressed. Shamelessly lifting the veil enhances the repression, reinforces it, obfuscates it. Showing the hidden side, the obscene side in full display is the apex of repression. And this was Lacan's vain intervention, to introduce a little bit of shame into time of shamelessness, to keep the sense of ontological shame in a shameless world. So, where does this leave us? How to get out of the traps of ontology and nevertheless show fidelity to its tradition? I try to propose a way with my minimalistic idea of on-tology as a maximum condensation of a number of thorny problems, pinning a lot on this simple short word, on. Humpty Dumpty in Alice says, when I make a word do a lot of work, I always pay it extra. And I think I owe a fat extra fee to this word on, for I really made it work hard. On in Greek, on in English, in French, and the spin-offs of haunting and ontology. And I'm aware that there is the danger of the proliferation of punning. It's contagious. Puns as if spontaneously breed more puns. The spectacular case is Finnegan's Wake. Joyce constantly adding puns. Joyce, as opposed to Beckett, is the man of n+1. For any number of puns, there are always additional puns. And Beckett's adage from Wordsworth Ho, very short adage, is the opposite. Add, question mark, never. Full stop. Add, never. I love this. So there can be this proliferation of punning into bad infinity. But the point is not punning per se, but rather producing a matem of punning itself, a pun that reflects punning into itself and cuts it short. And my wager is that on may be such a pun, a sort of matem, of being. I have no final message to deliver except for on, in the face of shameless times. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, wait. Thank you, Mladen. That was amazing. There is time for Q&A. There's a mic for people online, so they can hear you as well. I'll just pass it around. Okay. I think you first, and then we go to Claudia Brodsky.
Hi. Oh, it works. Thank you very much for your talk and for multiplying all of these ways of being for us. I have a comment first and then a question. First, I hope that while you're here in Princeton, you can visit Derrida's archive, because it's a very interesting place, especially because his books are themselves sort of archives. He put all kinds of documents related to his own books in his books. And if you go and open up his Spectres of Marx, you'll find some very surprising things. The first and perhaps most surprising is an advertisement for lingerie. So there's a bit of shame you might feel when you open it, but if you unfold it, you see on the other side that there's an ad for, or not an ad, a story about the assassination of Chris Hani, who was an anti-apartheid activist. So it's a very elegant poetic object, and I hope, and I would encourage everyone, by the way, to go in and just see what emerges out of these books, because surprising things just pop out. The second is a question, and it's related to number and negation. It's on your reading of the French on. Among like really conservative French, like the Académie Française, that are afraid of the degradation of the language, they fear the on because they think it might be the disappearance of the nous. This is a very common structure when people speak colloquial. They say, nous on va. So there's a disjoint between the emphatic pronoun that identifies, nous, and the on, which allows you to not have to say an extra syllable when you conjugate. And so in this sort of collapse of the nous into the on, we have a shift in number that's really interesting and very uncertain, because we don't know what the nous contains. And I think that this move of the plural into the singular, you could see it as a very anxiety-producing political question, which is both that of representation and the structure of sovereignty. So my question with that, like seeing that reduction of plurality into the singular as a possible negation, I want to know, how can you pluralize negativity in this pluralization of positivity? How can we think the multiplicity of negations or antitheses rather than substantializing negativity, as so often happens in thought?
Well, thank you very much for this question. Yeah, I don't think I have an immediate good answer to this. I think it's a very relevant question. And I didn't address this at all. I somehow opposed the I and the on, and took I as a sort of privatization of language, and on as a sort of marker of this language always already being there, and the necessary alienation, the risk of alienation we have to take to acquire language at all. And the impersonal dimension of this, which can be liberating. And I believe that if I made this rather quick sort of critique of privatization of language by assertion of an I, of privatization of this impersonal buzz of language which is around. If I made this quick sort of critique, it could follow from there that what we would actually need, is the formation of a collectivity of nous, of we, the pluralization. I just somehow, maybe too simplistically, spoke about the expropriation of the I, without proposing a perspective of a formation of a nous. And this would be a good way to follow. Yes, I can see the point of your question. I just somehow didn't address this at all in this scope. I thought I addressed too many things already somehow. It's a compressed paper, so sorry. I hope you were with me somehow.
Is this, yeah, it's working, okay. A lot of things to say. First, I just want to say to this person that this use of on and nous in French is something that's being used now to describe to English speakers why they should get used to using they as opposed to a singular gender designation that kind of falls, it only falls apart grammatically because qu'est-ce qu'on fait? On va, nous y, and then they say nous y allons. So there's a switch between the two conjugations. It's not going to be the same with they. So it doesn't quite work, but it's being used now. I hear it a lot as a way of describing this, what we're calling gender fluidity, but it's this fluidity not between sovereign and collective, but which is very, it's we the royalty, right? It's always been there, that on, right, that has always been there. But first, I just want to say this thing because I don't know if anybody knows about this or if we all live in such easy circumstances that we don't know that, of course, people die of shame. Every day they are dying of shame. And one would have to be in the world of talking ontology to actually enter the world of puns, which is wonderful. It gives us all a vacation. It's nice when contingency does the work for us. It's fantastic. I love it myself. I love puns. But of course people die of shame, probably more than almost anything else, right? So it's usually about someone else's non-being. Why am I alive? That you all know this, right? This is what happens. It's not just happen. It happens to survivors constantly. You think, well, you went through all this. Now, why did you kill yourself? And that's the thing that we living sort of beat our heads against the wall. But of course, people die of shame. They have and if Freud knows this. He understands the Rätsel. He called it the riddle of suicide, which is that this melancholia, which does not come to an end except in when you destroy the object, which has famously said, cast its shadow upon yourself and has become indistinguishable from the self. So somehow, in order for the self to survive, it must kill itself. This is really a true fact. There is suicide, and it's very often based on shame, right, of some kind. Guilt, which you said, / shame. Let me just say that. Also, in Hegel, it's not puns. And Hegel doesn't say it's puns. I'm so sorry. It is Aufhebung. It is Aufhebung. It is the concrete version of that word, which means literally to preserve, to keep under Tupperware, to keep under wraps, to set aside. And that is another meaning of Aufhebung. That sublation is also preservation. But it's not a pun exactly. His whole thesis was that the most abstract term carries within it the most concrete. But that doesn't make it a pun. For him, it was essentially his entire philosophy, that would be the real, right? That the ideal would be the most concrete in that sense. So there are so many of these, and you're right, he's constantly saying them, and we all laugh because when we look at the German, we say, or English does this sometimes too, though, not so much French, but when we look at it, we say, oh yeah, but you know what that really originally meant, right? And this concrete thing, but it's not the same as a pun, which is a Witz, right? It's like, only we notice the puns. Language is not noticing puns, right? Like only we, because we have the cleverness, notice that, oh, look what I've said. I've said something very different from what I thought I meant. That's all. But he really meant preservation as well as Aufhebung. That's part of the deal. So the complexity of combining the totally abstract with the concrete, that's his thesis. That's Hegel. That's what he's doing. And it's not the same thing as an anagram. It's not the same thing as a pun, and puns are great. Ontology, you know very well, and I can hear that you know very well. It's another word for writing for Derrida. Derrida, whom I knew, and I love Derrida, I've spent his career giving us synonyms for writing. And writing and it's not a bad thing, right? Hegel did the same thing his entire career too. It's not a bad thing. But what I'm trying to say is, he would be very flattered, but also, I believe, somewhat appalled by, except unless you're doing a critique of ontology here, by anyone sort of ascribing an ontological notion, basis, even interest to what he's calling ontology. It's not that the spectrum comes and replaces the presence. His thesis, as you well know, is that the mark of the absence precedes the notion of presence. And it's so plain. We don't have a notion of presence until it's in everything that he wrote, right? So he's not honestly not an ontologist. I would say he's pretty much, yes, the notion of writing allows for ontology. In fact, it allows for every ontologist to do this thing, which I'm just going to ask you about because you were doing it for most of your talk. And Heidegger, by the way, also does it with his Anspruch. It speaks to us. Being speaks to us. The claim, right, or that it's the roof, right? It calls to us, and we should listen on her. We should listen attentively to being. The ventriloquism of being, which all ontology seems compelled to engage in, without a second of self-criticism, which is not what Benveniste does, and it is not what Beckett does. If Beckett, by the way, did that, Beckett wouldn't be writing, because being, that wouldn't be so hard for him. Being would simply, speak, and it wouldn't have much to say, quite frankly. It would be, do you understand? Benveniste. It just seems to me so backwards, Benveniste, because you've mixed in people who seem to say the opposite of the ontological perspective, but truly the opposite in the most specific terms. It's their whole careers. Benveniste. Being doesn't speak. We speak in order to have a sense of being. That's the basis of that article. There are only subject positions because grammar enables us to have them, right? Which is another way of saying writing in Derrida. You understand what I'm trying to say? It's not that being speaks. It's like we're speaking and endowing ourselves with being by speaking. And that's what Hamlet, to be or not to be. Give me a break. It's the longest play because that's not the question. The question is to do or not to do. And he never does it. Instead, he speaks. This is fact. I mean, that's not like a clever insight or something like that. It's that he's literally asking the wrong question. And so he doesn't do, right? He has to have these players do it. You see, he has to do a simulacrum of it, right? Very Derridian move. Anyway, that's what I want to say. Is there some sense in which listening to and the speaking of being doesn't seem in some way, the psyche is a slightly different story. I'm not sure that the psychic ontology is either the way to go, but the idea that all ontology has to speak for being and give being this voice, which obviously being does kind of not have. The one thing I think, nobody knows anything about being, but I think we all know it doesn't speak, except for Heidegger. He really thought it spoke. He's out there listening, right? But do you see what I'm trying to say? The need to ventriloquize a concept that we have called being, which for Derrida is, of course, based on the fact that something had to give us an inscription before we even got to that concept. Doesn't it make anyone feel that shameful that we're just ventriloquizing all these objects? And no, I guess not. But anyway, okay. That's right.
Yeah, well, you raised a number of questions.
Yeah.
Very, very different questions, and it would take a long discussion for each of your points. So I must be brief. First of all, people die of shame. Yeah, I'm aware of it, and so was Lacan. He said it seldom happens that people die of shame. And then he gives this reflexive version of the shame of not having died of shame. But this shame of not having died of shame can eventually indeed lead to suicide. And precisely the Holocaust survivors, having the shame of having survived.
Well, in this country, veterans
And ever so many actually finished in suicide. So I'm aware of this. He doesn't make a claim that this doesn't happen. He makes a claim that the very notion of big other has withered to that small proportion, let's say. People wouldn't feel really the shame in the way that they would really die of shame. that this has been it has been a decline. The notion of the big other in front of which one feels ashamed.
Maybe in France, but there really people constantly feeling themselves in this way. And I'm doing drugs. I mean, why, how did I
Of
fail
shame.
at this? How did I fail at this? How did I fail?
No, there's
Undergraduates feel themselves. I mean, it's a horrible thing to say, but in this country, we don't have a paucity, unfortunately, of that built in. I don't mean to freak everybody out here. Veterans, undergraduate students are not the same things. But
I think they die of shame. Is this the best qualification?
the shame of failure, because if it weren't externalized as shame, you see, then maybe they could just get on with themselves. But it's all, as Freud would say, it's the look from the external side that causes this, right? And that causes, and when you internalize it, it becomes melancholy. It does.
There was a long discussion. There's a lot of literature on this. I mean, there was a long discussion among anthropologists between Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict in the 30s, which introduced this concept of cultures of shame and cultures of guilt. And the basic stake in this discussion was that you have certain cultures of shame, which are basically the Eastern cultures, but also the Homeric Greece, where losing one's face is a terrible thing. Whereas the Christian culture, in this perspective, is a culture of guilt, basically. There's an opposition between the two. There's a slightly different logic. So I would have to see what exactly we mean by guilt and shame. I think they're two different things. But yes, I think guilt has a lot to do with people killing themselves at some point. There's too much guilt for them to bear. And as to this general discussion about guilt and shame, I mean, their presupposition in this anthropological discussion was that shame is externalized, as it were. One loses the face in front of the other, whereas guilt is internalized. So the stake of the discussion was that there is a sort of progress from the cultures of shame to the cultures of guilt, to internalization of the big other, as it were, which is, I think, a questionable thesis. Questionable because we somehow put the cultures on a certain scale and grade them according to our Christian Western standards. And say, look, we have internalized. And those who are outside, they haven't internalized guilt, they're still the cultures of shame. One presupposes a certain value judgment in this. It's not a neutral discussion. I think it's a very interesting discussion. And so I think a lot of conceptual distinctions would have to be made within this shame versus guilt. What exactly one speaks about. Is to Hegel. No, I concede the point that Aufhebung in German is not a pun. It becomes a pun when you try to translate it into any other language, because no other language has this. But you have a number. I didn't make the whole list, but where is it? The word plays in Hegel. There is like, how does he introduce the notion of one in logic? He introduces it on the basis of German colloquial expression was für ein, which doesn't exist in other languages. No? He asks was für ein, and therefore now we should speak about one, which is a pun. No? And when he introduces the notion of Grund, he extrapolates it from the German expression zugrunde gehen. No? And when he considers the notion of Wahrnehmung, which is perception, he says, well, to take something as true is Wahrnehmung, which is literally, yeah.
That's not a pun. That's just the meaning of Wahrnehmung, meaning of good. That's what I meant to say. A pun is a kind of joke. And that is the constitution of a lot of German. These complete terms which have been...
Yeah, well, but there are wordplays. There are wordplays on these terms. There's a wordplay on this term. You know, he uses it as a speculative resource as a wordplay. Okay. As to the question of ontology being about writing, there is a long discussion, but at no point, let me just say in very general terms, did I try to say that ontology should replace ontology? This is not. Hmm?
I think Derrida would have loved it if it replaced ontology myself.
No. I mean, the point of the paper was how to get out of the traps of ontology and look at the punning resources, which seem to be very trivial resources of language, to do conceptual work and to do serious conceptual work. And this is what linked these different parts of my talk: the question of on, and the question of haunting in Derrida, and the question of ontology, the shame in Lacan. Looking at these resources, the resources of punning, well, of wordplay, more largely, homonymies, to do the conceptual work to produce the effect of universality on the basis of contingency. This was my basic point. Yeah, and at no point did I try to propose a new ontology. Ontology should just be seen as a sort of displacement of the whole project of ontology.
I think Derrida would agree with that.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Thank you for entertaining my comments.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I have another pun that's persisting and bothering me, and I don't know if it's a dead end or not, but it's maybe related to the discussion about la honte, shame. And your comments made me think of a line in Aimé Césaire's poem, Ma honte retrouvée, when the subject of Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, he finds himself on a bus facing another black man, probably in Paris, and he sees him and thinks of him as ugly, he says. And then he realizes his shame. Ma honte retrouvée, he says. And thinking about what you were saying, shame rather than shamelessness, the way that moment in that poem is key, I think, in the constitution of his subjectivity, negritude and all of that, a critical black subjectivity, something like that. I keep thinking of a different version of ontology, which would be honte, H-O-N-T-E, to, it, in Czech, maybe in Slovenian, I don't know, to, T-O, logis, L-O-G-I-S, as a demeure, a place for le ça, to, a place for the it, for the unconscious, ontologie. And so my question, which might be a dead end, but at least it's a pun, is there some, so there's I think a very interesting and crucial relation between shame, la honte, and subjectivity. But what about the unconscious, honte to, le ça, logis? What's the relation between shame? Is there anything to say about the relation between shame and the unconscious? I don't know. I'm just troubled by the pun.
No, I love the further pun with to, which is actually, okay, this is Slav languages, the sa, indeed in my own language as well, which would, extend this punning exercise even further. But as to the conceptual link between shame and the unconscious, I think put it that way, that the unconscious is not the same as le ça. And Freud proposed two entries into psychoanalysis. One was through Traumdeutung and the psychopathology of everyday life and the book on jokes. And there he speaks about the unconscious as opposed to the preconscious and conscious. And then he proposes a second sort of topology of Lisa, well, id, ego, and superego, which is the different kind of take on it. And he proposes this on the basis of 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, his starting point where he introduces the drive, and then later, in his later writings. And there was a lot of puzzlement about the fact that Freud actually proposed 2 different entries into psychoanalysis. One is the entry through the unconscious and through what Lacan calls the unconscious structured like a language. And indeed, in the 3 books on the dreams, on the slips, and on jokes, these are the slippages of language. These are the puns. This is what the formations of unconscious are made of. It's linked to the question of language. On the drive, on the other hand, is stumm. It doesn't emit sounds. It doesn't speak. The drive doesn't speak. And Freud insists on this. This is not a language phenomenon. It's linked to when he introduces drive, it's linked to the bodily orifices, to the stages of the development of libido, etc., but not to language. And this is it's a major enigma. Like how do these 2 entries fit together? The one entry which is based on the unconscious being structured like language, and the other one which is just mute and dumb, as it were. There is no mention of language in the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. And there are only 5 years difference. So how to fit this together? And okay, Lacan had all kinds of propositions about this, but this is a long introduction to say a very short thing. But I would think that the shame pertains to Lessa as this speechless, mute being, not to the unconscious as structured as language. So it would pertain to the question of drive, rather to the question of desire. Because the desire is linked up with the fireworks of language. And Freud's basic thesis in the Traumdeutung is that the dream is a wish fulfillment, is a fulfillment of a desire. And he, in the whole of Traumdeutung, the big, thick book, there are only 2 offhanded mentions of the notion of the drive, of the trip. It's not a concept at all. Nothing in the beginning of psychoanalysis pointed in the direction of the drive. So shame would pertain to this other part, the mute part, the speechless part, of just being there and being exposed, being speechless and being ashamed. And one would want to vanish and one can't.
We might have to, might ask it at dinner because we're running a little short. Okay. Thank you so much. There is snacks and wine outside. We have a bit time before we have to rush in for dinner. Thank you so much for coming.
I can take.